thank you so much for that introduction, Eric. It was a real pleasure to host a few of the farms that I see around this room today at our farm a few years ago. And I just want my wife Regina, would you stand up on me? We're partners in all of this. And so I'm glad that she's with me. She's the better public speaker of the two of us. So you got the second string today, but this is something I'm certainly passionate about and happy to share with you today. Now I need help in how to move forward. Yeah, so this is on our farm. Regina and I farm with our daughter Erin, who is now 15. She was a little younger in that photo. And we're right in the central part of Vermont. And as Eric said, we've been on the farm about 15 years, and we've been organic since the year 2000. And we milk about 40 cows, which is smaller than average, even for the state of Vermont, which is now 130 cows is the average. This morning, what I'd like to do is to share with you a little bit of our personal history and the journey that we are on in our farming, and the background of how we got there, and how that informed some of the decisions that we've made on our farm, as well as I'd like to highlight some of the efforts around cooperation that have been that we find significant in our lives. So Regina and I, we both we're not from farm families. We both had grandparents in Pennsylvania that were farming. This is a picture of Regina's grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania. Regina went there as a young child and visited, and I had the exact same experience on my grandfather's farm. This is Regina's grandfather, Elam Landis, who grew tobacco and beef. And this is my family, Levi and Miriam Mast. They raised 13 children on the same size farm that we have, about 125 acres, near Reading, Pennsylvania. And as a child, I went and visited. At least a week a year I would spend on that farm. And that's really where I got inoculated into the whole idea of wanting to farm. And that's me as a little guy on one of those visits. And so I grew up with a very strong desire to farm. And I caught the vision for the joy of milking cows and living on a farm. And so I worked on farms in Vermont, where I grew up, and as well as a few in Pennsylvania, and in Kansas I spent some summers. And while I grew to have a strong appreciation and a desire to milk cows and to farm, it really wasn't a very encouraging outlook for young farmers at that time. I think the year that I was born, they say that there were 7,000 dairy farms in the state of Vermont, and by the time that I was considering farming in the 1980s, there was only 3,000. And the number was declining. Almost all the farms that I worked for eventually sold out. And so the prospect of going to farming wasn't something that you took lightly. But so I went to the University of Vermont, determined that I would pursue agriculture. And it was there that I ran into a professor that was starting to think differently. Bill Murphy had written a book called Greener Pastures on Your Side of the Fence. And that was a very informative moment for me, because I started to learn that there was some positive opportunities in grazing cows. And at that time there was this called the Pasture Outreach Program, which Bill Murphy was at the core of. And what that was is farmers that had started rotational grazing, as Francis has outlined for us, the merits of putting inputs of management into your pasture so that you get higher productivity. Started those farmers that had begun the process of learning that were helping other farmers. And that was a very powerful thing. The technology itself is very empowering because a farmer goes out and watches his pastures grow, how they're growing. He makes decisions. It's not the feed salesman that tells you how to feed your cows. A lot of it is your own interpretation of what's happening on your own farm, and that's a very empowering thing for a farmer. And also, there was the power of farmers helping each other. There were discussion groups that were organized because at that time, the Extension Service was not behind it, and the researchers were not behind it. So it was the farmers themselves that did this. I say that as a little bit of a background. I was ready to go into farming at that point when I was getting finished with college. But I'd also come up with a strong desire to experience the world in a service opportunity. The church that I was attending really suggested that if you would give at least a part of your life towards doing something in outreach, then you'd be enriched by that. So after I finished my animal science degree at the University of Vermont, I went for a service term in Bangladesh, and that's when I met, preparing for that's when I met Eric. So I was sent to an assignment in Bangladesh working as a livestock researcher. And I was to provide some support services for the poorest of the poor farmers in the delta regions of Bangladesh. This is a farmer that I worked with. He actually had 11 sons, or 11 children. And I did, as an example of some of the research that we did with, they were, in this area, they were interested in trying sheep. So as a researcher, I was part of a process. A lot of times we were able to provide inputs of information and perhaps experimentation that they couldn't provide for themselves. But in a lot of ways, the most important thing was connecting farmers to each other. I took he and another van load, kind of like came to Vermont, van load of farmers around to a different region where they did raise sheep. And that's how, I found that to be a very effective part of it. And that's what I wanted to say in this slide in part, is that a lot of this is about relationships. And a lot of it's about energy too. Francis, I think we're channeling each other this morning. While I was in Bangladesh, I was very impressed. You know, the kilocalories into production are less than what they're produced. They actually produce more calories on their land than they take off it. And of course, this is animal traction. There's a lot of problems with this system, but we also have a lot to learn about, you know, the encouraging model that they have, or the encouraging example that their energy, in terms of energy efficiency, their agriculture actually, in some ways, surpasses ours. So, well, these cows are very hardworking. Doing tillage for the plowing for the rice crop, they're also milking and probably raising a calf as well. Most of the farms that I worked with had less than 2 acres as their land holdings, and very few even owned a cow, but they would, the ones that did only own one, they would get a neighbor's cow in to work with them. And this is planting rice. One of the most impressive things that I brought home with me from Bangladesh was the value of on-farm plant seed saving and the love of varieties of rice. In the region that I was in, there was hundreds of different varieties of rice that all had unique characteristics and tastes. And when you sat around the tea shop, that's what you talked about. The farmer talked about how well they grew and which tasted better, lots of arguments. And there was appreciation for diversity in the seed system. And that's something that was tucked away. It wasn't part of my background. That's not the way this country has been moving in my lifetime. And just, there was a lot of joy in all of this. Returning after 3 years in Bangladesh, Regina and I rediscovered our great friendship for each other, and we're married. And Regina's had been working as a social worker, and we opened up a farm stand, and this was in the early 90s, kind of before the local eating movement had really taken off, but we discovered that the community really rallied around us as we opened up a farm stand kind of in the middle of our neighborhood. There was a 2-acre patch of land that was available, and we just raised vegetables in there and direct marketed for the most part. A little bit of sales to restaurants. But it was an important time for us because in some ways we started the process of planning what our life together would be like and what we really wanted. And it was at that point that we decided that we wanted to do a term of service together as a married couple before we settled down to doing something as crazy as buying a farm and milking cows. And we knew that a mortgage was going to be a commitment, and we better had to do our term of service before that. So we again went with Mennonite Central Committee to Bitkin, Chad, which is the center part of Africa. And as you can see, the terrain is very arid. It's just below the Sahara Desert, so it couldn't be any different than Bangladesh. And of course, not nearly as populated. And what we were charged with there was to work on market gardening. And the people in this region had, for a long time, been purchasing onions and garlic from regions far away. There was a market truck that came through once a week, and they were interested in growing their own onions and garlic. And since we had experience in market gardening, that's what we went to do. So this is, we wanted to set up a demonstration garden of sorts and to be able to do some different research projects. And so we had a half-acre piece of land that was covered with thorns when we started. And that was me at the start. And of course, the first thing that I did was want to get rid of all those thorns, and I had in mind to burn them to pieces because, so they would never ever grow back again. But luckily for me, we had help, and the local people told us that, oh, you better had to do that, you better had save them. And they taught us how to take the thorns and lay them out in piles so that they flattened down and became fencing material. Because little did we know that huge droves of nomadic cattle and camels and sheep were going to be coming through in a couple months. And you better have a fence. So Regina's there is walking into the fenced-in garden area that we did. And we put in a well. They taught me how to dig a well, and I gave some help with I'm pulling on a rower pump there, which is an improved technology. You probably saw that in Tanzania. Yeah. And so again, I just wanted to point out that farmers have a lot of knowledge and ways of helping each other, and it was a truly important time for us to be able to interact with the folks in Bitkin that we were with. And after that term of service, we came home and were intent on getting started farming on our own. And Regina there is standing in front of our farm sign, and the farm that we eventually came to in Randolph Center. And it was at that point that we started to do a lot. We felt like it was important to write ourselves a farm plan and to write out which values we found most important. There's the holistic resource management is a process by Alan Savory, and we used a very crude iteration of that methodology. But I just think it's so important. We have referred back to that and updated our plan pretty much every year, and it's very important. But what was part of the plan was definitely being able to produce food which we felt was healthy and good for our communities and good for the land that we produced it on. And we really felt like we were sojourners on the land that we had come to, and we needed to leave it better for the next generation. And I think, the year that we moved to our farm, our daughter was born, and so everything changes when you have a baby, and everyone knows that. Erin went with us everywhere we went, and so the concerns of everything that happened on the farm pretty much involved her at that point. As I said before, we're true believers in the merits of grazing. And this is kind of the view from our house. The mainstay of our grazing system is the bluegrass and clover, which grows very nicely in association together. The clover tends to feed the bluegrass. Our climate is such that we have pretty cool summers. We don't experience the kind of heat that you folks probably do here. And bluegrass is the mainstay and grows quite well. It does slow down, but our farm is situated such, and we chose a farm where the buildings were central and we have laneways that move around, very much similar to what Francis has outlined, and for all the same reasons. When Francis talked about reducing the use of manure spreading and chopping the feed, that's what we call the 50% plan. And once the cows go out, we're 50% less energy going into everything. You have to work spreading manure, have to work bringing in bedding. We don't need as much bedding because the cows are out completely outside. It really is, the first day of turnout is Independence Day as far as we're concerned. So one of the first things that we had to do when we came to the farm, well, our plan was to go organic from the start, but we needed to transition the land. It had been conventional up until the time we purchased it. We needed a 3-year transition period, and at that time so we shipped to a local conventional market, but our plan was to eventually find an organic market, and that was about the same time that Organic Valley was coming to Vermont, and they had started as a very small co-op in Lafarge, Wisconsin, with just 17 farms. I believe they originally started to collectively market produce, but it branched into dairy. And as it says here, the unique thing about this is it's farmer-owned and shared risk and shared rewards. And when they came to Vermont, there was only a handful of us that really at that point were interested. They started talking to us. I remember the first meeting, the CEO, George Seaman, showed up, and in his typical style, he had his shoes off within the first few minutes and had his bare feet up on the chair. And that's kind of the style of communication that he came forth with. And since it was just a few of us, he presented the idea that if we wanted to ship markets, that there was the benefits that we would have would be a stable price, collective bargaining, and that we would be a family of farms. And we found that has been a very meaningful experience for us. And while we were at that point, there was only 3 of us that formed the first truckload. Within these 15 years that we're shipping now, there's 125 Organic Valley farms. And it also moved to different parts of the country. Here in the Dayton area, I believe there's 9 or 10 farms that ship to Organic Valley. So, are there any in the room? Any? Yeah. Oh. Good. So, and I just wanted to, these are some slides that I've brought from Organic Valley. I certainly don't have the technology to make these up. And we're only going to 2011, but it does show us what the conventional pay price has been. And in comparison to the upper lines there, that's the Midwest and the Northeast pay price, if you can follow the lines, New England pay price. So the way that pricing is developed is based on not only the market, but also on the needs of different regions, the cost of production being higher in the Northeast, where there's longer winters and less crops, further distance from the grain producing areas. And that's decided through a process. And farmers are involved in that process as well in deciding what the pay price should be. And really it's accomplished by matching the supply with the demand. new farmers are brought on when there's demand in the marketplace. And if you if we go on beyond 2011, you'll see the trend basically continues. And one significant thing that I would point out is, I mean, you see what the pay price on the conventional market is. You know, we started farming here in the 1998, and that was, you know, $12 milk. That was the same pay price my grandfather received on his farm in 1970. So you can imagine, you know, the stress of doing that. It's made a huge difference to our farm that we can have a fair and sustained pay price that continues to grow as expenses have grown. And that's what allows us to stay at the 35 cows, which matches our land, the size of our land base in the forage producing capacity. So I just wanted to point out too that as Organic Valley has grown, there's been a need to evolve. And I think it's always going to be a challenge as any organization grows bigger to continue to maintain the spirit that it started with. And I see a real effort on Organic Valley's part to continue on with that. There's a lot of participation. I'm on a couple of committees. Each region where there is what we call a pool of producers, like the Dayton pool here, they have a representative who's part of the Dairy Executive Committee, which is involved in the running of the co-op. And recently there's been, as we've needed to consider energy and pasture production, there's committees which help guide the co-op on those issues. And one of the other aspects of Organic Valley that I find is near and dear to my heart and also to my home is the Farmers in Marketing program. This evolved sort of as out of the genesis of the program is that realization that farmers are the best spokespeople for organic production, for what's happening on their farms, and for why consumers should buy their milk and their milk products. And this is a farm tour on a farm right next to the Rodale Institute in Emmaus, Pennsylvania. James and Ida Burkholder own the farm. The woman is a dietitian. There's a whole group of dietitians there on that day. I happened to go to this field day, and her son. But the idea is that consumers drive this whole thing. Consumers are interested in knowing what's happening on the farm and how their food's produced, and being able to make the connections is important. Now, Regina works part-time for Organic Valley as the Farmers and Marketing Coordinator for the East Coast. And so basically her role is to help farmers connect with consumers. And events like this, where a lot of on-farm field days, are very important for getting the word out and getting people knowledgeable about what happens on farms. And this field day in particular is informative because it's right next to the Rodale Institute, which has been doing research for many, many years. And I know they've done at least one trial which is 30 years old. They compared conventional and organic to see side by side what the effects are in terms of not only economics but also in environmental impacts. And so they just, as they completed 30 years, they released some results which you can access a much more thorough report on the World Wide Web if you go to the Rodale website. But one of the important things I'll just point out that yields over the 30 years are not lower; they're actually higher for the organic systems, and that has a lot to do with resiliency during drought years and during severe weather events. The resiliency that Francis mentioned really shows up over time. And this isn't a real great graph for showing the impacts on profitability, but if you look at the second line under profit, it's very much higher for the organic. This is a corn, soy, wheat rotation that they monitored for 30 years. And there's alfalfa grown in there as well. But that's a big, big difference, 3 times as much. And then energy input and greenhouse gases. This is again, on the farmers and marketing, the power of relationships in getting people out onto the farms. This was a field day that I was at in southern Vermont. Ross Thurber is the man in the pink shirt, and the other people are co-op dairy food managers from around the Northeast coming out to a field day, and the lovely girl is Stella in the middle. It was a brown Swiss cow that had to be in the middle of everything. But just very powerful, and I have to say, as a farmer, I always go away from these things you know, enlightened by the interaction with both consumers and other people in the industry, because they really appreciate it. Now we're back to my farm, and just wanted to talk a little bit about our production system and what we do. And so, as I said before, the mainstay of our grazing is perennial pastures. But then we also, for the middle part of the summer, we plant warm season annuals like Japanese millet or sometimes Sudan grass. And Japanese millet is by far my favorite. And for our slightly cooler climate, works very well. Here the cows are grazing Japanese millet, and you can see some yellow in there. That's wild mustard. That's my biggest weed. But they love it, and they actually milk quite well on it. So they're going to nibble that off as we go through. This is the first time grazing through. And then this is what the second time looked like going through. And like Francis, I use a breakwater to advance. So the foreground, they've grazed it down, but you see they've eliminated almost all the wild mustard. And that's only important because I also, after they've grazed it twice, then I let it go to seed. And these are the seed heads that come. And about October, that's ready for harvest. And so I'm harvesting then with this combine. That's an Iowa combine, by the way. We had to import them. And just to back up a little bit, there's very little grain production in Vermont, so this is an oddity to even have a combine. But we harvest that seed crop then for sale to other farmers. And for me, that was a very important step for our farm to become seed producers, because for so long we had the only opportunity to buy seed to plant was from basically from the same source as anybody else, Cargill. And so I was happy to provide a local alternative. And wanted to show you too, this is Regina with her favorite cow, Shania. And we have gone to an all-forage diet for the last 4 years. And so that was not necessarily driven by economic reasons. We have been slowly reducing our grain inputs for a lot of years. Went from maybe 12 down to 2 pounds over a course of 10 years. But then we took the plunge about 4 years ago and just eliminated it completely. And that was mainly driven by a desire to be self-contained, to be self-sufficient on our farm. And it was easier for me to do that in our situation by just being all forage as opposed to growing our own grain. And we came to that conclusion because we started growing our own grain for cows and realized it's hard. We don't get as much production per acre as we do from grass. But also, the other driving thing was that consumers were asking us for the grain. They wanted the wheat that we were growing for flour. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But just wanted to point out that as we went to the all-forage system, we had to change our cows a little bit or continue to adapt them. We need cows that look like this, that kind of like a beach ball on legs. They have to eat that much more. They have to have that much more intake. And so we have to have high-quality forages going into them, and it has to be very digestible. And more importantly to her, it's got to be really palatable. She's got to really want to eat it. So that's what we're working at all the time on our farm. And it's kind of a fun process, really. The other thing we worked at is season extension, like same as Francis. This is foraged turnips, and we also grow oats for late season grazing because it goes a little bit later into the fall, even after it's frozen and we get a little bit of snow on, the cows can keep grazing. So we feel like the longer into the year that we can extend our grazing season, it's not only good for our cows, but also for the omega-3s. And here is, this is Susan, who works for the University of Vermont, and we're part of a study there which is looking at the correlation between omega-3s that are in the forages and omega-3s that are in the milk. And many other factors as well, but that's the nutshell of it. Looking at how forages in diets affect the milk that we're producing. And this is a multi-year study. She's out every week and measures during the grazing season, takes forage samples, measures the dry matter production that we're feeding the cows, and then takes a sample of milk as well. And so the preliminary results from these kind of studies that have been happening both in-house at Organic Valley and other universities is that it makes a tremendous impact, and all forage diets affect it too. There's something about when you remove starch from the diet. So stay tuned for that. But I just wanted to say, you know, that's an important aspect on our farm. And just to show you a little bit, our cropping system, the way that the cows are integrated with the flour production, is that we usually have a warm season annual opens up the crop rotation. Like in this case, that was BMR sorghum Sudan, and then we're drilling in winter spelt for the winter season. And then this is what spelt looks like growing. It's a wonderful grain for our cropping system. It tends to really be a good nurse crop. So we plant, in March or April, we spread red clover seed, and sometimes I'll mix in a grass seed as well, but we frost seed it. Even when the snow is still on the ground, we have snow pretty much into March and April. And then that seeds itself and grows up, and then after harvest time, the clovers take off again. And so we're only out of forage production for half a season, and then we're back making clover again. And so this is spelt, and I guess the other thing that I wanted to introduce in this is how we got started growing grain in the first place for the flour market. As I said, we were brought to owning a combine by the need for combining our milk seed, and then we started growing a little bit of flour to just wheat to just dabble for our own personal use. And next thing you know, these local boards were knocking on our door. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to all of you, but local boards are people that are trying to eat as local as possible. In our state, in the month of October, they had a local board challenge where if you could eat everything that you consume locally for the month of October. And so the people that were involved in that movement asked all the local growers if they would set us down at a meeting at a local library and said, what do we have to do to get you guys to get flour to the market? Because although Vermont historically has produced a lot of grain, they hadn't been for years and years, and we didn't have any infrastructure. There's about 5 of us growing wheat in the state. And so they sat us down and said, what are the missing links? What do we need to do? We said, well, we don't even really know what the market depth is. We don't know what people want. They says, okay, great, we'll do a marketing study. So they did. They organized in their network. They went out and surveyed all the co-ops and the grocery stores and the mom and pops and said, what do you think the volume would be? And it made a huge difference because that empowered a lot of us to kind of gear up a little bit, to plant a few more acres. And the next thing that happened was that the bakers started getting involved. There was bakers that they liked the different kinds of wheats that were growing. They tasted better, they said. And many of us were growing heirloom varieties. I grow, my spring grain is red fife. It's a spring hard red wheat, and it has a very good flavor and very good baking qualities. And so we started partnering with, the bakers started attending our meetings. And the next thing you know, researchers, Heather Darby is in the center there. And she came to be a part of the group and asked what research needed to be done. And so it's just been a wonderful collective effort, because without one piece or another, we wouldn't have gotten nearly as far as we could have. In this slide, we're doing a bake test with all the different heirloom varieties that we grew. A baker baked them in the parking lot of a local co-op. We're doing a taste test, so all the consumers could come and sample the different varieties. And this is a plot combine, which is used for research, and it was through the collective efforts of this diverse group that I spoke of, the Northern Grain Growers Association, that that came to be. I remember the car ride when we went to petition the Vermont State Agriculture Department to give us, see if we could get $10,000 to purchase that machine. It was a baker, a consumer, a farmer, and a researcher all went together and talked to the State Department, and together we got the grant. And that's very important for us, because that enabled us to do the variety trials that that we needed to determine which was the best varieties to grow in our region. And so otherwise we had been harvesting them by hand before, and that was not very fun. So development of a website was key. And if you have a chance and would like to go to that website, although it's focused on the northern regions, there's a lot of good information there if you're seeking it. And that has been key for, in this day and age, helping people to learn. And so the final slide that I have up here is just to point out that I think relationships are key. Relationships in between farmers, as we saw, and in between the land and the animals and communities. And so I think when all those things come together, it's very powerful, and so that's what I have today. Thank you.
Again, if somebody would have a question, we'd ask that you use the mic over here. Don, do you have one? I have a mic here. Don, do you have a question?
Do I have a question?
I thought you might.
Yeah, Brent.
Just put it on there for people.
Mary and I were neighbors of Brent and Regina for maybe 10 years up in Vermont. What is it that gives Vermont and Vermonters and the community of which you're part, with Jack Blazer and Heather Darby and the extension community and the university community and the state government, what is it do you think that's brought all of those elements of Vermont society together? It's being such a small state and yet being such a leader in this movement to healthier food, local, fresh farming, so forth, and increase in family farming.
Were people able to hear all Don's question? Yeah, what is it that brought us together to foster this movement along? I think maybe, Don, you may have said it in some of yourself, the size and the smallness of the state has to be a part of it. And I believe it really is the genuine concerted efforts of people being able to pull together that have brought it along the quickest. And I would have to say, the encouragement of people like you, Don, because yeah, that really has been a part of it, is that when people have energy, they put it right into into efforts that they see as working well. And I'm sure that that same spirit's alive here very much. So,
Beidler, I'm Stephen Burson with J-Mark Agriculture Consumer Services. Obviously, you've demonstrated that there is a growing interest and demand for organic milk. And most people who care about that would probably prefer that the milk they get be from grazing only dairies instead of buying organic grain from the Midwest. Do you see space in the marketplace for grazing only dairies, and is that something y'all ever considered?
great question, thank you. Yes, actually, Organic Valley set out and piloted doing a grass-only milk in California, and that just started it's less than a year now. And that's going, and it's a cream on top product, and have moved that now. They're planning on doing that in the Midwest as well. And some of the challenges are that the grazing only farms are few and far. They're spread out, and so that has been a challenge. But yes, it does seem like there's a certain group of people which are very interested in purchasing that type of product. And there's plans to try in other regions as well, if it moves forward. And I know that I didn't mention this, but having regional milks is very important for organic, for the whole model. The Co-op Act, the CROPP actually stands for Collective Regions Organic Producers Pools, and so that they're trying to have a regional product which is produced, from a select group of farms in a certain region. For example, right now in the Northeast, there's a milk which is produced locally, and it's not ultra pasteurized; it's just standard pasteurization. And so the hope is that that will move around the country as well.
Thank you again, Brent.